Now, as many will know, there's been a big falling out in Reform UK. Great Yarmouth MP Rupert Lowe has lost the whip amid an investigation by the party which he says is a witch hunt. The ongoing dispute has become a major headache for leader Nigel Farage, not least because, far from internal squabbling, the insurgent populist party has a vital task ahead of it: turning around Britain's decline. But are they serious enough to do it? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Douglas Carswell, who was the MP for Clacton from 2010 to 2017, and he's now living in America, where he's president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. So welcome to The Sceptic, Douglas.
Hello, Laurie. Lovely to take part in your show. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. Okay, so there are immense problems facing Britain at the moment and immense policy challenges for the British right to face and to try and get to grips with. And obviously this falling out with Lowe and Reform is, an annoyance and a distraction from that. But I suppose just to start with, has this lack of a focus on policy from Reform, has that surprised you at all?
Well, it's difficult, and I speak from first-hand experience. It's difficult for a start-up party, an insurgent party, to come along and to shake things up. I know that because when I joined UKIP and I won a seat for UKIP in a by-election and then held it in a general election, I learnt firsthand quite how difficult it is. It's not just the difficulties that an insurgent party faces with the electoral system. You get all these teething problems. When you create a startup party, you need to have a very charismatic leader, and Reform UKIP certainly has that with Nigel Farage. But equally, as you grow, you need to grow into something more broad-based and collegiate, and it's difficult. These are teething problems, and those who are familiar with the minutiae of the history of UKIP and the Brexit Party and now Reform will be all too familiar with them. I'm not going to get into that because my view is that I don't really care who does the things we need to fix Britain. I just want to see them done. And I don't really have a dog in the fight in the sense that I don't really care if it's the Conservative Party that does this under Kemi or Jenrick, or whether it's Reform that does it. At some point, we need to recognise that the country is heading towards a catastrophe. And it's heading towards a catastrophe not just because of the current Muppets in the government, but because basically since 1997, we have had a succession of Blairite governments. We've had governments that have not necessarily been led by Tony Blair, in fact, governments that haven't always been Labour governments, but we've had an essentially Blairite succession of prime ministers and governments. That is to say, we've been led by people who, number one, believe that the free market needs to be directed and controlled and regulated by regulators and central bankers. We've had a succession of governments who believe in rights being something created by charters and the universal application of those rights, and indeed who believe in the universal nature of human nature. They don't believe there's anything distinctive or particular about the West or about Britain. And for that reason, we've seen, in a sense, a Blairite coup, a Blairite upending of the British legal tradition. It has empowered remote officials. The Blairite governments have all passed power away from anyone that you can hold to account to unelected officials. And we saw this initially when Blair came in, giving the Bank of England independence, but we saw it too under Boris Johnson, where a committee of experts decided to lock down the country in response to a seasonal flu pandemic. We've seen a succession of Blairite governments, and they have been a disaster and a catastrophe. And fundamentally, what we need is an alternative to this, and only the right can provide that alternative. It may be Labour. It may be Conservative. It may be Reform. It certainly won't be Labour. I'm not really interested in which personality or which bit of which party delivers that leadership. I don't want to get involved in the soap opera, but we do need a fundamental shift in the direction of the country to avert it from disaster. The country is rapidly moving to become a third world country, not only because it is allowing the third world into the country, but because its economic performance, its productivity, and its debt will basically make Britain a second, if not third world country.
Do you think people grasp how much the Human Rights Act has changed our constitution?
I think the right is only just waking up to this, and I think the right is still largely clueless as to what to do to tackle it. Now, we all read about the symptoms when we see a judge allowing an immigrant to stay in the country because his child likes fried chicken or some nonsense like that. We see almost weekly judges making decisions that they shouldn't be making, not just on immigration. We've seen judges decide on whether or not the UK should be able to use gas and oil reserves in the North Sea. Again and again and again, we see judges making decisions that they have absolutely no right to make. And certainly the people on the right rail against the consequences of the empowerment of the judiciary, but they're pretty clueless as to what's caused it and to what to do about it. And I think we need to understand the nature of the problem. It goes beyond simply the actions of one or two judges. Since the Blairites got in 1997, they incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. That, number one, allowed judges to adjudicate on the basis of a very vaguely worded charter that empowered them. But it goes beyond that. They created a Supreme Court, Order number 53, I think it is, of which determines the scope of judicial review. This has been extended so that judges can not only strike down ministerial decisions, they can basically mandate what the minister should be doing as a policy in place of what they've struck down. So we've seen through the creation of the Supreme Court and the extension of judicial review, the creation of an almost sort of group of unelected judges empowered to make policy. And this has not really been properly understood, the extent to which this coup has happened. But it's Laurie, if I may say, it's even worse than that. The Blairite legal revolution has not just created a Supreme Court. They have upended the old English common law idea of equality before the law. Equality before the law goes way back, I would say actually probably to Anglo-Saxon tribal tradition, the idea that everyone is bound by the same set of rules. They've overturned this tradition to create a system in Britain where, because of human rights law, different types of people living in our country are treated differently by the law. There are now 9 protected characteristics. These are immutable characteristics. And if you possess, thanks to human rights law, if you possess these immutable characteristics that make you a protected characteristic person, you are treated differently under the law. We have created a legal system in the UK now where state bodies, public bodies, are mandated by the law to discriminate against white English people in England. This is not fantasy. This is actually what has happened. We have created the opposite of equality before the law. We've created a legal hierarchy in which white British people are treated and discriminated against by their legal system in their own country, in defiance of their own legal and folk traditions. This is extraordinary. Let me put it this way, Laurie. Ever since we created all this plethora of human rights legislation, the whole premise of it has been that it would allow judges to guard us against the actions of arbitrary government. But there's one occasion in my life when the government really behaved arbitrarily, when they decided in response to COVID to put me under house arrest, to prevent me from walking around Richmond Park in my own time, to prevent my child from going to a school of our choice, to prevent us going about our lives as ordinary English folk. This was a gross violation of our human rights. They put us under house arrest. And not a single human rights lawyer, not a single human rights judge intervened to stop it. So the idea that human rights legislation protects our liberties is for the birds. It's a nonsense. What it has done instead is create this perverted legal idea that judges may decide on public policy and that the public may be ordered in a hierarchy of preference with English people at the bottom of that ladder in their own country. We need to recognize this. We need to realize that it is morally abhorrent, and we need to overturn it. And if necessary, we need to drive out from the bench judges who, through overreach, make decisions they have no business of making. But it's not just a case of, I think, sacking some judges. That will be necessary. I think we need to do specific things. We need to change Order 53, I think it is, of the Supreme Court to limit the scope of judicial review. We need to abolish the Judicial Appointments Commission so that we don't have judges appointing judges. We need to remove from the bench those diversity hire judges who clearly aren't up to the job. I think we need to investigate whether or not some judges used arbitrary decision-making to unfairly incarcerate British people for expressing opinions online. Clearly, there have been some people in our country who have been sent to prison, not for committing a criminal offence, not for incitement to violence, but for simply saying things that the judge found to be obnoxious. We need far-reaching reform of the judiciary, starting with judicial review, judicial appointments process. I think we also need to look at the 2003, I think it is, Communications Act. That makes it a criminal offence to say things that are grossly offensive. Now, I hope that some of the things that I've just been saying to you will be deemed grossly offensive by most judges in Britain. I'm not doing my job properly if I haven't said something that grossly offends them. But in a free country, you should be able to say things that someone else says they find grossly offensive. It shouldn't be a crime to say things that are grossly offensive. In a free society, unless you're able to say things that someone else finds offensive, you're not able to articulate and debate things that need to be articulated and debated. So we need some far-reaching reforms, I think, if we are to undo the damage of the Blairite ascendancy.
And I should add that the 2003 Communications Act, not only does it criminalise saying grossly offensive things online, but it criminalises saying them even in private, in a private WhatsApp, for example, and even if no one there is actually offended.
There was one of these judges, I can't remember his name, but I suspect he was a diversity hire given his background, who not only incarcerated some, I think there were police officers, for saying in a WhatsApp group some pretty obnoxious things. Don't get me wrong, the people who said these things in a WhatsApp group were pretty obnoxious and offensive. But being obnoxious and offensive is not a crime. And yet not only did the judge who put them in prison do so, rather alarmingly, this diversity hire judge who doesn't appear to understand the traditions of English liberty also sits on the Judicial Appointments Commission as one of the commissars. This is simply intolerable.
And so a key point about the Judicial Appointments Commission is that it's billed as this sort of independent Blairite quango. And of course, we've seen this as well recently with the Sentencing Council, which is both an independent quango, but also one stuff with lawyers. So there's kind of both elements of it there. But there's this idea, isn't there, that if you hive off bits of parliamentary sovereignty to these independent bodies, then the decisions that they make will somehow be independent and they'll be expert and they'll be sort of better than the decisions that would be made otherwise. But in fact, they often come out with these quite outrageous decisions, as with these new sentencing guidelines. And so how important is it to get away from that assumption that just because it's independent, it's automatically assumed to be better?
Britain is in the mess it is because these powers have been given to unelected bodies. So, for example, the Independent Bank of England was so incompetent at controlling the currency. They presided over, first of all, a banking crisis over a decade ago, and then runaway inflation. The Migratory Advisory Commission was so incompetent at its job that it allowed 2 million people of low skilled into the country without asking fundamental questions as to whether or not those arrivals' skills were needed. In fact, they've lowered the per capita GDP of the country, and without asking fundamental questions about cultural compatibility. I would say a lot of those recent arrivals come from backgrounds that make them culturally incompatible. They will never become British and certainly never become English. So why have we let 1 in 27 people now living in the UK into the country in the past 24 months? Because we gave the power to a panel of experts. The sentencing commissioners that you talk about, again, they've come up with a proposal that is fundamentally hostile to the principle of equality before the law. So again and again and again, we like this idea of the disinterested expert, the technocrat, the person in command of all the information, making dispassionate decisions. The reality is that when you give people like that power, they incarcerate you in your house for months at a time because they are so blinded to one set of data, to one set of expert spreadsheets that they've got, that they can't see the bigger picture. It is no way to run a country. In fact, it is a way to run a country into the ground. Giving unaccountable experts power has been the ruin of the country. And yet it's been the one constant of all the Blairite governments we've had since 1997. They've all done it. They've all done it. Blair did it. Cameron did it. Brown did it. May did it. Boris Johnson did it. This is what defines that succession of disastrous prime ministers as the Blairite ascendancy. What we need is to recognize the damage of the Blairite ascendancy and to push back. We don't need a revolution in Britain. We need a restoration. They are the revolutionaries. They are the people who have destroyed the country with a legal coup d'etat, who have destroyed the country with an anti-democratic, technocratic coup d'etat. What we need is ordinary people of England, British people, the English folk, to recognize that their country has been destroyed by the Blairite ascendancy and to mobilize to push back against it. We can fix the country. We can solve the country's problems. We don't need to go the way of failing third world countries. We can restore the country, but a restoration requires us to understand the full scale of the disaster of the Blairite ascendancy. They're all the same, incidentally. There's no fundamental philosophical distinction between David Cameron's government and Tony Blair's government, or between Boris Johnson's pathetic administration and the catastrophe of Gordon Brown's government. They're all fundamentally the same. I won't be rude and say, in the infamous words of George Galloway, that they're different butts of the same arse, but they are basically the same Blairite ascendancy, and they have been a catastrophe for the country.
And so we've talked about the legal coup and also the coup of the technocrats, but I think a third aspect of the Blairite ascendancy has been multiculturalism and the sort of subverting of neutral processes of the law. And in particular, we have ideas like community policing now. But I've also been doing some research recently on the way that hate crimes are treated by the state. And this depends to a large extent on what are called hate crime scrutiny panels. And, well, who's on the panels? It's representative of victim groups, but only certain groups, right? And so this is kind of instantiating this paradigm where some groups get special favors and others don't. But how important is it? I mean, I think it'll be very difficult, but how important is it to unpick that whole multicultural paradigm to return to a neutral application of the rule of law?
Again, we don't like the consequences of this multicultural agenda because we can see the unfairness of it. It elevates certain groups above others. It gives certain people with certain characteristics, often, for example, Muslims or certain minority groups, sort of elevated say. It undoes and dilutes the fundamental idea that the police are the public and the public are the police and the police are the public. It instead defines the police as agents of the state, with certain ethnic interest groups having a closer whisper in their ear than others. What we need to do is not just push against the consequences of this multicultural mess. We need to go back to first principle. Why have we ended up here? The Blairite ascendancy, all of them, fundamentally believe in the universal condition of humankind. They believe that all people are basically interchangeable, that if you take an Eritrean who turned up in Britain 5 minutes ago, he's only a few moments away, a few degrees away from becoming an Englishman. Now, this is a nonsense. We know this is a nonsense. We know that there are cultural influences and perhaps differences of time preference and differences of aptitude mean that actually people are not interchangeable. You can't take an Eritrean and make him English any more than you can take an Englishman and make him an Eritrean. And yet, because of the ideology of the universalists who believe in human nature being the same, we have seen a series of policies pursued that are disastrous. If you believe that all humans are interchangeable and you have a shortage of skilled humans in Birmingham or Manchester, the solution is just to import people from the rest of the world to make up the gap. We've seen this ideology for 30, 40 years. It's the argument in favor of mass immigration. We're told that we need mass immigration because it's going to be good for the economy. It's not. It's been a disaster. If you look at the stats, quite clearly we have imported people into the country who don't produce much economically, who are a net fiscal burden to the country. Nearly half of all people living in social housing in London were born overseas. If you look at some of the stats that are now emerging, looking at benefit claimants, something like nearly half of all people from Congo living in the UK are on some form of benefit. Now, why the heck are we importing people from the Congo? We have no historic connection with the Congo. people from the Congo are not known as great innovators in science and technology. They are, if you look at the data, known as disproportionately likely to commit offences, have a higher propensity towards violence, and be more likely to live at public expense. Why are we importing large numbers of people from a country like that? The answer is because we're governed by fanatical ideologues, extremists, who believe that someone from the Congo is only a short moment away from becoming British or English. This is a fantasy way of running a country, and it's not sustainable anymore. So we need to recognize that the myth of the elite that human nature is interchangeable is the root cause of the problem. And we need to push back against this. Now, for years, if anyone had said what I've just said, they would have been shouted down for being racist or culturalist or a supremacist. Well, let's have this conversation. Not all cultures are the same. They're simply not. Some cultures are better at sending manned missions to Mars, and some cultures are better at committing gross outrages in Rotherham. Not all cultures are the same. So why do we pretend they're the same? And why do we pretend that by allowing large numbers of people from Kashmir into the UK, we're somehow creating a generation of doctors and engineers? We're not. We're creating huge social problems. And we need to recognize and address this. We need the cultural confidence to be able to assert that we believe as British people that the British way of life is better than other ways of life. Now, if you disagree with that basic premise, there's nothing to stop you from going and living your life elsewhere. You can go and live in a different country, but I happen to believe that the US, UK, Anglosphere way of life is the best way to live your life. That's why I choose to spend my life living in the Anglosphere. Once we have the cultural confidence to assert that we believe that in our societies, our way of life is the better way of life, and once we have the moral courage and the moral authority to recognize that, we can perhaps begin to push back and say, we're not going to, out of moral fear, invite the local imam to join our local police watchdog. We don't need to, because we're a democracy, and anyone in the community is free to be involved in community policing and community engagement. We don't need to make special allowances for particular groups out of a misplaced sense of guilt. We don't need to, in pursuit of community cohesion, break up the community and categorize it by ethnicity. This is England, land of the English. Everyone is equal before the law. If you want to live here, you must accept the basic premise that all are equal, all will be treated individually under the law. And if you don't like it, and if you want to live a different way of life, you're free to leave. And we need to begin to say that. We begin to need to make these arguments.
And I do wonder, I mean, there's that tendency towards universalism, isn't there? You know, assuming that everyone's like us. It's this very ideological view, as you say. And I think that goes all the way back to the 1948 British Nationality Act, which sort of almost forgot to define who we were and what British citizenship consisted in. And so I wonder if we're taking a path towards reasserting what that cultural identity is, would it also be necessary to reassert legally what, you know, the British and English identities are?
I think so. I mean, I always sort of just lazily regarded myself as British. Ethnically, I'm part English, part Scottish, part Irish. I used to be English when I watched the rugby. I used to be British most of the rest of the time, and I didn't really give it much thought. But I began to, when I represented Clacton, begin to actually identify much more closely with Englishness, because I began to, amongst the people I represented, feel this sense of alienation from the establishment, that we're being overlooked in our own country. And I remember the first time I put a St. George's cross on my car in April on St. George's Day. And I remember thinking, this isn't just about football. There happened to be a football tournament at around the same time. I was picking up from my constituents this idea that actually there's an identity, an English identity that hasn't been spoken to. I think in a weird way, the Universalists have ended up bizarrely doing the opposite of universalism. what their universalism has paradoxically done is treated people differently on the basis of their race and their ethnicity. And one of the consequences of this, it's begun to awaken this sense of, and it's dismissed as ethno-nationalism, but it's only ethno-nationalism when it's white British people saying it. It's actually, I think, a sort of deeper ethnic identity. And it's begun to stir this identity up. And I'm not sure that the left is going to like the results, because I think once English people begin to define themselves as English and begin to ask themselves basic questions and begin to play back the tape they've had played to them for so long, but substituting every other group with the words English, I think actually you will see a very strong sense of English identity emerge from this. I think it would be a good thing. I mean, I hope that English identity never becomes a sort of twee picture postcard idea of, Morris dancers prancing around a maypole or people wearing bowler hats. But I think there is a search for a more fundamental, meaningful English identity. And it's not going to be about Morris dancers. It's not going to be twee. It's going to be a recognition that this is the country that produced Shakespeare, that produced Charles Darwin, that produced Jane Austen, that produced Alan Turing. This is a country that led the world with the Industrial Revolution, with the Democratic Revolution, with the rule of law. This is a country that has produced not just an economically and technologically innovative society that's barely been surpassed outside the Anglosphere, but a country that has produced a morally better, a morally superior way of life. That is why this country abolished the slave trade. That is why this country is so popular amongst people from non-Western countries who want a better way of life, because our way of life is a better way of life. That is why people try to cross the English Channel, not because France is so hellishly dreadful, but because the English way of life is a better way of life. I think we're beginning to see the stirrings of this recognition from the English, that they don't need to apologize. They don't need to decolonize Shakespeare. Shakespeare, as I think your own Toby Young famously said, Shakespeare is not an example of English cultural exceptionalism. It's evidence of English cultural exceptionalism, and we should embrace it. We should relish it. We should glory in it. We should glory in being English. We should glory in being British. We shouldn't apologize for it. And we should assert English ideas about equality before the law. And we should, I think, ultimately be prepared to remove from office an essentially un-English, un-British, anti-British elite that has run the country for 30 years. The Japanese went through a similar process in the late 19th century. They were governed by the same parasitical elite for 400 years, an elite that had held the country back, made it insular, made it particularly ill-suited to modernity. The Japanese realized in the late 19th century that if they didn't adapt their country, if they didn't change the way the country was run internally, they would end up like all those other Asian countries being dominated by the European powers. And so they had not a revolution, they had a restoration, the Meiji Restoration, and they overthrew the parasitic elite that was holding the country back. Britain needs a British version of the Meiji Restoration. We must learn from that other island nation, Japan, and we must fundamentally change the way our country is run. We need to change if we are to preserve what is good about our country, because the people running our country now are hurtling us off a precipice, economically and demographically.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for, but I think those kinds of sentiments are certainly the kind of thing that Reform or any other populist right party will need to be taking up if they want to effect the kind of change that we need. Douglas Carswell, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.